Hello and welcome. How close is Iran to another revolution? Well, even though the situation calmed down somewhat after the violent riots following last June's disputed presidential election, a tense undercurrent has remained, putting into question the strength of the government's hold on power. There were echoes of the public's discontent in December, where anti-government demonstrations led to more violence in which 8 people were killed. It was yet another reminder of the stark political divisions between the supporters of the government and its reformist opposition. The biggest rallies happened on Ashura, Shia Islam's most important religious day. Security forces detained hundreds of opposition protesters, including several foreign nationals, according to Iran's government, which accused those protesters of, quote, leading a psychological war against the system, unquote. Tehran also blames Western nations for fomenting the opposition movement. The US, UK, France and many other Western countries condemned the crackdown. The main opposition leader, Mir Hossein Mousavi, whose nephew was killed in December, says he's ready to sacrifice his life for his convictions. His defeat in last June's presidential election to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad triggered Iran's ongoing political crisis. Today we ask, how far will Iran's leadership go in dealing with its internal turmoil? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and we'll also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is Iranian-American journalist and writer Azadeh Moaveni in Cambridge, England. She's written numerous articles on Iran and is also the author of the book Honeymoon in Tehran. From Los Angeles, we have political analyst Soraya Sepahpour-Ulrich joining us, and she's extensively researched US foreign policy towards Iran. Good to have her back. With me in the studio, also back with us, is Hilary Mann-Leverett, a former US diplomat who presently heads Strategia, a political risk consultancy working on Middle East issues, and she's published a website called The Race for Iran at theraceforiran.com. We welcome you all to the show.
Thank you.
Soraya, welcome back, and if I could start with you there in Los Angeles and ask about the situation that's currently taking place in Iran. We've got the Iranian government saying the West is waging a, quote, soft war against it, and it's clamped down on the foreigners and international organizations, as I mentioned. I know you're wary of how the Western media can take a very one-sided approach when it comes to the situation in a country such as Iran, but I wonder, isn't that kind of move, this extent of this move, going to be very counterproductive and provide more ammunition for those who say Iran's regime is so oppressive?
Riz, thank you for having me on your show. I think that it's nothing new that the West is painting a distorted image of what's going on in Iran. I also want to mention that it's very normal to have political dissent in any country. Iran is not unique in that sense. But what's happening is, by distorting the image of what's going on, the political dissent in Iran, it's not doing the opposition any favors. The opposition in Iran will, whatever they do, will be blamed on it will be blamed on the Western media and the Western powers. So in a way, their movement has been hijacked. I do believe firmly that although the movement is genuine, I also believe that the Westerners, especially the United States and Israel, had a hand in it also. So it's a combination of both.
A quick question then.
But it's really not doing them any favor whatsoever.
Let me ask you then, what do you feel are the biggest distortions in the Western media about what's going on? What do you feel is the real picture and then the difference in the way it's projected out from the Western media?
Well, I think the biggest difference is that these people genuinely want some change, and the changes they want vary. Some want just more jobs, it's economical, some want more freedoms, but a lot of people in the West seem to think that they want to get rid of the regime altogether. That's not necessarily the case. I was there a couple of months ago. Some of them just want more personal liberties. And the Western media, especially America, wants to change this around and make them believe that they want to get rid of the regime altogether. And Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's son, and the Mujahideen, they're standing in line thinking that they're in line for the next to be taken to Iran to negotiate a deal with America. That's not necessarily the case. All they want is just relax the rules a bit, and I think Ahmadinejad heeded this. And if they were left alone, then the opposition would be able to have a party and reconcile with the government.
We'll look at some of the things that might develop in just a second. Thanks for that perspective. I want to bring in Azadeh Moaveni here and ask your take on what's going on and to what degree, well, what basically does this sort of long-running string of demonstrations since June last year tell you about the Iranian public's approach to the government? Do you agree with what Soraya is saying?
I have a somewhat different take. I think that 6 months ago, people wanted the government to heed the rules. 6 months ago, people wanted a new election to be convened and wanted their basic electoral rights under the Constitution. But I think that much has changed since then, and what we see as what is being called the Green Movement has become quite radicalized in the face of the government refusing to compromise or to meet any of its demands and instead brutally cracking down. So I think now, certainly there's no agreement. The opposition doesn't speak in one voice, but there is certainly a very radical element emerging who is chanting in the streets for a different kind of rule, questioning the entire system of Islamic government. Now, is that the majority of protesters? I think it's hard to say. I think that the government has restricted reporting so much that it's hard to measure whether that reflects sort of a broad demand.
Azadeh, let me ask you then, do you feel that these demonstrations, this sort of long-running series of protests, has had any real impact on what's happening in Iran?
I think that absolutely. I think we're at a very significant moment, and the momentum is certainly on the side of the protesters. I think that right now, professors at Tehran University, football players, directors, Nobel Peace Prize winner Shireen Ebadi, the country's cultural and social heroes are all on the side of a movement that is growing increasingly critical. So I think that the moral momentum is certainly on the side of the protests. And what's striking, I think, is a lot of people discounted this 6 months ago as a protest movement that might fizzle out because it didn't have leadership. But what we're seeing is an incredibly resilient movement that's finding lots of ways to reflect its energy.
Well, let me bring in Hilary Mann-Leverett. Good to have you back here on the show as well. And I wonder what you expect will come out of this clampdown on so many organizations. I mean, you know, 60+ organizations and foreigners accused of this psychological war against Iran.
I don't think much is going to come. I think what we've seen in Iran today is particularly as portrayed in the Western media, is an exaggeration of some sort of uprising, an intifada, as many have described it inside Iran, or maybe even the fall of the Berlin Wall, people have said. It's nothing of the sort. We've had protests and very clear divisions within the Iranian government from the beginning of the revolution, from the assassination and the exile of a prime minister early on to the going after dissidents in Europe in the 1980s, killing intellectuals in 1998, 5 were killed. In 1999, there were widespread student demonstrations inside Iran. This, I think, is just another cycle in this kind of ferment and divisions within the Islamic Republic that we've had since 1979. What I think you see the government concerned about now, and I think they have a point here, though it's very unpopular to say so, particularly in Washington, D.C., is that the United States has, for especially the past 8 years under President Bush, and this is a critically important point, President Obama has decided not to stop it, has pursued both a covert and an overt program to destabilize and undermine the government in Iran. Now, that doesn't mean that the Americans, I think, are orchestrating any protests on the streets of Iran, but it does mean that there were $400 million appropriated for covert activities to destabilize that government. So that government is legitimately concerned that any American activity is suspect. Now, the way that translates, I think, into the latest decision by a part of the Iranian government to so-called ban Iranians from having contacts with some foreign organizations, some of which I'm associated with. My website, the Race for Iran, is associated with one of the organizations on this banned list. But many of us, including myself, met with President Ahmadinejad in September when he was in New York. And my understanding is the desire to keep those contacts remains the same, even though there are parts of the Iranian government that have taken this concern about U.S. involvement to probably a too concerned of a level.
Let me put to you, Hilary, a question we got, or a comment we got from a viewer in California who believes that America is only looking out for its own interests here. Nick Ziegler wrote in from California saying, "My country, the US, has intervened in Iran before on the pretense of supporting democracy while actually supporting authoritarian elements in the country. We support democracy so long as the right people are elected." So you're saying basically President Obama has continued this policy of the Bush administration. What happened to his desire to engage?
I think we really have to question, and I have been questioning it for some time, whether his rhetorical articulations to engage Iran were just that, whether they were just nice words, whether the Nowruz message was just a nice speech, or whether there was some real strategic thinking, purposeful strategic thinking behind that. I've questioned it now for some time, and I think today everybody who really cares about what's going to happen in the United States, the U.S., in the Middle East, and in the Middle East itself, really needs to question what Obama is doing. We see this in terms of his seriousness regarding Iran, regarding Israel-Palestine, regarding Afghanistan. He comes up with great rhetorical formulations, but then there's very little behind it. Very little serious strategic thinking behind it.
Well, you know, we're going to take a short break here because we've got many more viewer questions I want to get to everyone here. So stand by, everyone. We're going to take take a short break, and then we have more of our discussion in just a moment.